Good morning, and thank you for joining us today. For our next conversation, we have Jackie Gonzalez, the Policy Director from Immigrant Defense Advocates, as well as my colleague, Deputy Director Adriana Sanchez-Ochoa, and myself, Courtnie Thomas, and I am the Mental Health Policy Advisor for NextGen Policy. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation that we talk about the nexus of mental health and immigrant rights in the immigrant community, and particularly in light of COVID, as well as how everyone is dealing within this past year and a half of all the collective trauma that we've all been going through. So starts off a little heavy, but I do want to just do a general check-in. I like to start these conversations often just like so that we're all present and we know this is going to be put out into, the universe. And so I want us to start and just kind of check in with ourselves. These past few days have been traumatic just in light of all the things that have happened in Minnesota, and I have family in Minnesota. And so it's definitely something that has weighed on me, but I am incredibly grateful to be able to still do the work that I am, that we talk about mental health and we, talk about how all of the communities that have continuously been underserved, whether that is the Black community, the immigrant community, women. At this point, I think that there's coming to a real nexus and a real conversation about, okay, so everyone has done anti-racism reading, right, from last summer, and everyone has hopefully done all the worksheets and all the things. So now we have to use that power that we've drawn on and make it actionable. So I'm really excited about this conversation because I think this is another layer of which NextGen policy can say how we are invested and involved, and we want to be moving in the right direction when it comes to immigrant rights and health and mental health. I don't know who wants to go next.
I'll go. Good morning, everybody. Adriana Sanchez-Ochoa, as Courtnie stated, I am the Deputy Director of NextGen Policy. Been at the organization about 5 years, and previous to that, spent about 18 years in the legislature. One of my policy areas is immigration, and so I'm super excited to engage in this conversation for many reasons. I think one, just as an immigrant to this country and my own experience and my family's experience, although not heavily impacted by what immigration looks like today, because when I immigrated here, things were very different. So the path and the journey was different, but definitely have been working with these communities and have seen and felt the pain that immigrant communities have endured and the effect that that has on their mental health and their well-being, not just for the detainee or the immigrant that's going through, a case, but for the families of those folks. And so on that note, I'm super excited. I am even more excited to be here with my friend and colleague, Jackie Gonzalez, who, the universe has a way of putting people together. And I'm extremely proud to have had the opportunity to work with IDA and with Jackie and her partner Hamid in engaging in very meaningful legislation that has impacted California. And as we all know, California leads. And so we have led with some of the legislation that has been championed by Jackie. So excited and really looking forward to the conversation.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Adriana. Jackie, would you mind just telling us about yourself and introducing yourself? And we'd love to start this conversation with you.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. As Adriana mentioned, it's really a pleasure to be here with you all. I'm the Policy Director of Immigrant Defense Advocates. It's a fairly recent project launched last year, actually, January 2020. So it was a pretty interesting time to launch a project and then be hit with the pandemic. We can talk about that later. But by training, I'm a deportation defense attorney, so spent about 10 years representing folks who were held in detention centers and also not detained, going through the removal process in court. And a few years ago, moved to Sacramento to really focus on policy sort of at the height of the Trump administration, which is when I was fortunate enough to connect with Adriana. And I think that so much of the work in my time in Sacramento has really been inspired and supported by NextGen and by Adriana specifically. So really excited to talk about some of the things that we've been able to do together. And in terms of how I'm feeling today, anytime I begin my day with going on a run, I feel good and very connected to the earth and to nature, which is what I did this morning. And it's spring. It's so beautiful here in the spring. And it feels, I think for me as a mom, dramatically different a year later, a year and change into the pandemic than when it first hit. And like so many other moms, was home with 2 children, like, what am I going to do with my life? And that's when we thought we only had to do this for a few weeks. And I can remember at sort of some of the most difficult moments last year in the spring, actually, reaching out to Adriana in shambles, to be quite honest, crying and saying, nobody in the state of California cares about detained immigrants in the middle of this pandemic. And I have tried like everything that I could possibly think of, and no one is responding. This is really horrible. And as usual, Adriana stepped in to support me and the work that we were doing, and to brainstorm and strategize about, where there were levers we could push, what else we could do. And for that, I'm eternally grateful. And I think that, everyone has benefited, at least the population that I represent, from the incredible support of Adriana as a person and of NextGen as an institution. So excited to begin this conversation, and thank you again.
No, absolutely. No, I've been working with Adriana. Definitely, you get the inspiration and the dedication of the communities that she's involved in and that she represents and that she is invested in. And I, get to, as you say, you get to see it firsthand, the passion that she has for the work that she's doing. It's exciting to kind of hear it in a way that's different from, me as her colleague hearing it. You mentioned that your organization was started in January of 2020. Can you give us a little bit of background about that, and like how did you get involved with it? And I'm making an assumption of like I know what the impetus was, but if you could kind of give us a little bit of a breakdown of like what inspired you to be a part of this organization and to create it and then go from there.
So as I mentioned earlier, I'd been spent the larger part of my career doing immigrant rights work. And I think, sort of how Adriana shared earlier, I do come from a family of immigrants, but my family is Cuban and certainly didn't suffer sort of some of the worst atrocities that we see inflicted on immigrant communities. But I did grow up in Miami, which is a very multicultural place. And I think, to be honest with you, until I left Miami, I didn't quite understand how unique and different it was than other parts of the US. I say to people, it almost feels like when you leave, you've left a foreign country and entered the United States. But that was really sort of, my childhood. And when I became an attorney, I did this for a really long time. And I always wanted to do policy. I think my initial sort of foray into immigrant rights work was because as a kid, I think I witnessed so much unjust immigration laws like inflicted on the communities and the diverse communities, Haitian community in Florida. And I knew I wanted to do that work, but I felt like I really wanted to represent people individually first and really understand what it is that, communities most cared about, where the pain was deepest and what needed to change. And so I did that for a really long time in the Bay Area. And then when Trump was elected, I felt like it was the right time to sort of step into the policy world. And I had young kids at the time. And, if you do immigration work, you think that sort of the way to affect change at a policy level is really federal, right? Because it's federal law. But I couldn't up and leave to DC. So I thought, well, where can I go? And I was like, Sacramento, that's where I'll go. And I told this story in a different forum that Adriana and I were just at, and I'm sure Adriana was at the legislature at this time and probably had a hand in this letter, but sort of the Latino leaders of the California legislature put out a really positive, proactive letter about defending, immigrant communities and how California was going to do all these things. And I was like, I've already spent, my entire career doing such, in some ways really depressing work, right? You're fighting this institution. I can't spend the next 4 years with this guy being in a defensive position. It's gonna kill me. Like I need to use my energy in a positive way. And so I I tried different ways to get to Sacramento, and none of them frankly worked out. So I got a 1-year gig, and I came and I did a few things like a budget request, and started sort of dabbling. And then right when I sort of finished that, the opportunity came up to work on a really big policy initiative that I think we'll discuss later. I worked on that bill. It was AB 32. And I learned so much in that year that I came, and meeting people like Adriana who supported the work and showed me how much was possible motivated me, I think, to you know what, if the position I want doesn't exist or I can't sort of find it, I'll just create it. And what I wanted to do was really just to wake up every day and think of how to push creative initiatives and work for detained immigrant populations. And I needed a platform to do that. So Immigrant Defense Advocates was an idea that grew out of really wanting to be proactive and nimble against a federal administration that was relentless in its attacks against immigrant communities. We felt that there was more that could be done at the state if we could push the envelope in terms of creativity. And that was really the impetus for it. I was lucky enough to have a few really critical people believe in the importance of doing that, Adriana primary among them. And so that's really what helped it launch. So we've been in operation just a year and change. And in that first year, we're able to pass another bill and also engage in some pretty significant advocacy. So that's the project.
That's really amazing. That's really amazing. And it's interesting. And I know that Adriana, you are going to go into kind of talking about the private detention facilities, but there was something that you mentioned that really struck me about recognizing where you put your energy, right? And how you need to be able to look at a thing, because Trump, man, is a real thing. And so, but like, how do you address that? You know, there are some folks that are going to respond and react in a defensive manner that works, but being able to kind of look at something objectively and say, like, how can I best use and serve my energies for both yourself, right? Because as you mentioned, you're a mom, so you've got to make sure that your energy is going to be pulled in multiple different directions, but also to make sure that you're not constantly waking up with this just like dread and with it weighing on you so negatively. So and again, that, this conversation is about obviously like the mental well-being and behavioral health of those within your work, but also of your own and our own, of tackling these issues and constantly having to make sure that we're doing check-ins on ourselves and saying, like, how am I doing? Not so great. How do I authentically move through this situation? And I think that it's great that you took this opportunity and you checked in yourself, and then you've created this really wonderful and impactful and important work that you're continuously working on. So I rambled enough, but I think I'm going to pass it off to Adriana now for you to kind of really get into the nitty gritty of your work of private detention facilities and dig into some of those bills that you mentioned, and we'll continue this conversation. Adriana?
Thanks, Court. I'm going to let Jackie do the specifics on these bills, but what I do want to talk about is something that was mentioned earlier about how we utilize our energy in moments of crises, right? And I think for a lot of people, sometimes in crises, we tend to shut down, or, we don't want to face the crises head on. And that was one of the things that really motivated me when I met Jackie, was the tenacity that she had and the will not to give up and say, we're just going to wait for this administration to, hopefully at that time, right, not get reelected. And then we'll deal with the aftermath of what this administration has done in the immigrant community, which has been far and wide. And Jackie's approach was different. Jackie's approach was one of, we need to tackle this head on. And this is what I believe. And we have people in detention centers that are being ignored. They're not a priority for anybody. And, we have to be that voice. There's that, old cliche, right? How can we be the voice of the voiceless? And Jackie did that along with her partner, Hamid, who's also with IDA. So when she came to me with this idea of starting an organization, and honestly, I'm going to say, and I probably have never said this to Jackie, I thought, okay, this girl has got like, she's serious. And I don't know that this is going to work in this climate, but I believed in her, but I also believed in the spirit behind what she was doing, right? Because, she's immigrated from Cuba. I immigrated from Colombia. Again, married to a Cuban who immigrated here. Our journeys were very different when we came to this country. And, I laugh at what she said, when you leave Miami, you feel like you've left a foreign country when you go somewhere else, because that is so true. I've spent a lot of time in Florida, and, Spanish is the first language. Like, if you speak Spanish, you're fine. Second is a plus, right? Especially in Miami. So the tenacity that she had and that vision was something that I thought, okay, let me see how we can be helpful. Let's see how we can get her to get this off the ground. And, it took collaboration from a lot of people believing in her work and in her, that strong fight that she had. And so, I'm really pleased and happy and proud to say that, we were able to give her some seed money to start this project and to see this vision through. And it's been a year, but man, has it been a full packed year. Like, we have done some amazing work. We have come against roadblocks and naysayers, and, IDA has just continued to push for what they believe in this space. And again, I think that the space that we're in when it comes to immigration, there's such a connection on mental health, and there's such a connection with the effects and the trauma that are suffered by families, by the community, by the workforce that's in these detention centers. And so the first bill that we engaged in was AB 32. And that bill it's the first of its kind. California has led. We've done AB 3228, which is the other bill that Jackie was talking about, which is, a continuation of 32 and not wanting it to stop there, but trying to figure out and close loopholes, right? And so closing detention centers, private detentions in California was a huge fight, but it was done. And it was done in such a way that it's now, the ripple effect of that is now being felt, both in the positive light, and then there's still things that need to be done. So with that, I think I'd just like Jackie to share, if you would, the fight of AB 32, and then the continuation of the work with 3228. And then we can talk a little bit about the work we're doing this year with our other bill, AB 263.
Sure. I guess I'd like to, center the conversation on AB 32 and give a little kind of background on, California's always been a leader in this space. And I'm lucky to be, I think, a part of this, little chapter, so to speak, in the last couple of years. But, before AB 32, there were a few bills that really did try to target the expansion of detention facilities in the state, and also to provide oversight and accountability. And those were bills that were pushed by, a variety of different immigrant rights organizations, really hard fought battles over the years. SB 29, which was one that stopped allowing cities and counties to contract or renew contracts to hold immigrants in detention. And AB 103, a bill that enabled California's Attorney General to go into these facilities and conduct inspections for health and safety. And there's additional bills, but I would say sort of in terms of closest in relation to AB 32. So there was certainly a really critical foundation here in California for this work. I think it's important to name that, because like so many of the things that we do, people came before us whose work it's important to sort of acknowledge. I mean, and some of you might remember that when Governor Newsom was elected, one of his really big campaign promises was to end the use of private prisons. And Assemblymember Bonta, now our newly nominated California nominee for California Attorney General, was a subject he was also passionate about. And he had tried to run that bill under Governor Brown, was unsuccessful, and was running it for a second time. And I was at the same time working with several immigrant rights organizations, many of the ones that had worked on the bills I just mentioned. And we'd had a discussion about, what we could do, because ICE had just announced that they wanted to expand detention in California. And there was a conversation around, trying to run legislation in the subsequent year, because it was pretty late for legislation that was serious legislation to be introduced it was basically June. And I had just finished working on something else, a fellowship to, so one of the things I'm most proud of, but it ended up becoming a footnote, so to speak, but it was an initiative I worked on with Assemblymember Bonta to increase the number of deportation defense attorneys in under-resourced regions of the state. That's an initiative that the state supported, Governor Newsom supported, and actually just launched this year. But we had the opportunity to work together. I knew it was something his staff cared about. And I asked, as I was talking to, to colleagues in the immigrant rights space, and I said, I think we could still try to do something. I think there's an opportunity. And I remember when I was working on the fellowship, I asked someone at Assemblymember Bonta's office, like, you guys have this bill, and why is it only for prisons? Why is it not for immigration? That was months before. And so when we started sort of getting together as a coalition of organizations to see what we could do, we brought back that idea. And, I already made it long, but we were able to essentially, convince Bonta at the last, really with days to spare, to amend that bill, to expand it to include all private facilities, which necessarily included detention. And I feel like that was sort of a pivotal turning point. That same weekend, I remember, is when I actually met Adriana, and it became a sort of all hands on deck kind of effort from there on. It was so late in the legislative cycle, but from NextGen to all the immigrant rights groups that worked on it to Assemblymember Bonta's office, it was a gargantuan effort to get that bill across. Many points where the bill was almost killed, honestly, because of the private prison lobby, but that the bill was signed by Governor Newsom. And about a week after, and I think this will sort of like lead us into other conversations, but I think it's important to sort of understand just how significant the bill was. It's not an exaggeration to say it was covered by every major news outlet, probably one of the most important pieces of legislation the governor signed that year, his pinned tweet for months. And a week later, ICE put out a solicitation to try and expand detention in California and sign contracts before the law took effect, January 1st. And they successfully rammed through, obviously in the Trump administration, this process and signed unprecedented contracts for 15 years. So extended the time that these facilities would be open in the state. So it became, and it continues to be, a very significant battle to invalidate those contracts. We've been sued as a state by the federal government and by ICE on this bill, but so far, the case will be heard on appeal, but so far we're winning. And when Adriana says it had ripple effects this year, and I think in part motivated because the court has found, that we have the right as a state to protect health, safety, and welfare. That's why we are trying to put an end to this industry. Many other states have introduced basically copycat AB 32 legislation. And, when we first were working on this bill, one of the biggest pushbacks was folks saying, if you shut down these facilities in the state of California, people are just going to be picked up and transferred to other states. Which is a big ICE talking point that, we push back against. Is in the first place, people don't have to be picked up. In the second place, they don't have the manpower to, send all those people away. And finally, we don't need to wait for the federal government, which I think is a theme we can sort of, really come back to throughout this conversation. If other states just look at what we're doing and they start doing it, ICE won't have anywhere else to send people. So we're not going to wait for federal immigration comprehensive reform. We're going to start doing this, and then we're going to have other states copy us, and then there'll be nowhere to send the people. That's obviously a very short, and condensed sort of theory, but I think those are that's the kind of sort of shift and mentality that I think that we need to have, because if not, we sit in a sort of paralyzed state. So I don't know, Adriana, there's so much we could say about this bill, but I think that's sort of just a little summary of the history and where we are today.
Yeah, I think that's it's a very condensed version. There's so much more that happened in, behind the scenes. But you mentioned then after 32 was signed by Governor Newsom, then Assemblymember Bonta was concerned about the conditions in the facilities that people lived in. And because they continued to operate, that's then where you had this other brainchild with other immigrant rights organizations and with his office to introduce 3228, which is another piece of legislation that we worked on very closely. And another, I think you described it, a first of its kind of bill that allows a person who's been detained, if they have been harmed while in detention, that they could, violating the standards of care in state court, they could actually file suit. They could actually speak up for themselves, right? So 3228, I think, really, in light of COVID, became that's what really pushed the envelope, right? In COVID, like all of us were sheltered at home. But when you're in a detention facility, there is no such thing as social distancing, right? There's no such thing. I mean, we had troubles getting protective PPE to detainees. So can you talk a little bit about that, Jackie? Once COVID hit and this pandemic impacts all of our lives, but the impact, I think, on the immigrant communities was huge. And specifically, I think what would be interesting would be to talk about the impact of COVID in these communities, in these detention facilities, but also the lack of access of PPE, and then the fact that they were completely ignored when we started talking about vaccines. I think that's another huge fight. So can you share a little bit about that?
Okay, sure. You can talk about these. So I'll try to break up my answers and let you interject as I go. This is about 2 hours worth of material with that question for me. Sorry to the audience, but in terms of just giving a background for those who might be listening and aren't as familiar, there are seven at present. There are 7 detention facilities in California that house immigrants. 6 of the 7 are privately operated. The one public facility that remains is a contract with the Yuba County Jail that I like to joke, it's not funny, obviously, but it's like a contract in perpetuity because it's like till 2099 or something. There's not that many people detained there, but we hope one day that will end. But the majority are these private facilities. And the impetus for AB 32, like I said earlier, was that just people are civilly detained. Let's just, if you are abolitionists, the first population that should be sort of released is those who are civilly detained. I mean, nobody here is serving even like a sentence of any kind. I don't believe anyone should be detained civilly or criminally, but I understand that people fall along different political, sort of on the spectrum, but the individuals in immigration facilities are detained civilly, not criminally, not for, violating any criminal law. So you have the pandemic hit, you have what is already sort of substandard conditions. These private corporations only concerned about their profit and bottom line, operating these places in the worst possible way. I mean, so many, deaths prior to COVID just because of lack of medical attention. And so, as Adriana mentioned, the bill was already introduced, and it wasn't introduced as a response to COVID. It was introduced because we knew these facilities were going to keep operating, while we worked on challenging sort of these illicit contracts. And so Assemblymember Bonta, wanted to do more. So we came up with the idea for 3228, and Adriana explained what the bill does, which is it basically allows an individual to sue when they've been harmed as a result of a violation of standards. So when the federal government contracts with a private operator, they sign a contract, and the contract says you have to comply with, these set of standards. The set of standards it refers to most often in these contracts are the federal standards set out. They're called the performance-based national standards. And that document is hundreds of pages long, and it touches every possible area you can imagine when you deprive someone of their liberty, understandably, right? People should be entitled to like a host of different protections, from food, hygiene, to access to a phone call, to medical attention. Those standards are, I would say, routinely disregarded by private detention operators. ICE has been using these private contractors across the nation for a very long time. There's federal government reports detailing how they violate these standards, but there's no accountability, because the only people that can police this issue is the federal government, but the federal government is the one contracting with the corporations, right? So you're stuck in this like Kafkaesque play of this horrible situation, but where the person who should be bringing down the hammer on the corporations is the one who's contracting with them, right, to expand detention. So we said we have to find a way to interject the state into this equation to bring accountability to what's happening. So the bill allows the individual to go into state court and do this. And that's why it's a first of its kind, because it says when there is a violation by a private operator, we're going to use state court to, to allow people who have been harmed to bring these claims basically in tort law, which is state law. So the bill got introduced, and then so much legislation, was lost during COVID, and you could only really keep a bill going if it had a strong COVID connection. And well, you can imagine how much stronger could the connection be than this bill to COVID for folks in detention, because as soon as COVID hit, advocates began, and this is when I made the reference earlier that, at one point last year, I just called Adriana like in tears, just being like, this is so awful. Nothing, the state is not doing anything to help, and even this one little bill that we have that would actually do something, not even immediately, right? But honestly, allow people to sue later, right? For the atrocities we knew were gonna unfold, and provide some level of reparations or dignity, right? Like I say post, but now I say posthumanist, and I'll say why in a minute. So the bill made it through, and it again, thanks very much to the sort of support of NextGen, Adriana stepping in and really pushing at a time when legislators were being told to cut everything, to really prioritize one or two bills. And of course, we need to thank Assemblymember Bonta for his continued leadership, and commitment to this. He did prioritize this bill. He did prioritize this issue. Right at the same time that sort of the bill started going to policy committees, what we had been warning about, which was that there were going to be outbreaks at these facilities, began to happen, right? And I would say to you, it's very similar to what happened at San Quentin, which I think a lot of people will sort of remember, right, from last year, but didn't capture the attention of the state and didn't sort of capture headlines in the same way. And we did actually manage to get, a little airtime at the San Quentin hearing at the state, but it was very little. And I think given that the population of immigrants is so high in this state and that we house more immigrants in detention than any other state, to me, it really felt like it wasn't enough. And we had basically the largest outbreaks of COVID in the entire nation happened here in California in immigration detention facilities at Otay Mesa. There's a memory I have, and I'm sure Adriana also has it, of Assemblymember Gonzalez going to try to deliver PPE to these facilities and not being let in to give masks. We were hearing from detainees who were organizing that there wasn't soap, there wasn't disinfectant. The largest outbreak in Otay at one point had over 150 individuals infected with COVID. And the first death, completely preventable in ICE detention from COVID, also happened here in California. And so that was the backdrop of this bill. And, we were, on the one hand, we were running this bill, and on the other hand, we were doing a lot of advocacy with folks in detention. My colleague Hamid helped draft and put out statements and letters from folks on the inside who held dozens of hunger strikes to try to draw attention to what was happening. And so I think that really 3228, we were able to get that bill through in, not just because of our hard work as sort of on the policy front, but I think against a backdrop where people inside that were suffering really organized to draw attention to what was happening to them in an otherwise sort of schizophrenic landscape where frankly, there was so much to do for so many vulnerable communities, and not to take away from, the need in so many other places. But to be detained, as Adriana said, and feel like it's just a matter of time. And then on top of it, no one is helping you, right? Or it doesn't seem like you're given the basic proper protective equipment, so it was a really desperate situation. I think for those of us working on the issue, it felt very draining and desperate. But again, we tried to move from a place of channeling our energy into something positive. And we were lucky to be able to do that with 3228.
I often think about what the families of these detainees must have been going through, right? The stress and the heartache of knowing, one, you can't visit, two, you can't take them anything that's not being provided by the facility, the mental health strain and the trauma I just can't imagine what families have went through. And we also, moving a little bit further into COVID, detention facilities were on the bottom of the list when it came to vaccines. And I know that Jackie, you and Hamid and other organizations worked really hard to get the attention to the need of prioritizing. I mean, it wasn't even, let's bump other people off this tier system, but let's just get this population into the plan. And, there was a lot of advocacy around this and reaching out to leadership. Can you briefly tell us a little bit about that journey and what finally happened to get the attention and vaccines, where the California Department of Public Health said, oh, you know what, maybe you guys were right. We need to prioritize this population. And, then vaccines started to roll out.
We were all really, I think, relieved, I can say for all, to see the vaccine sort of be developed and put out at the end of last year. It felt like sort of the first hopeful moment, right, in 2020. And I remember it was December and, basically the last week of work that we all have at nonprofits before, you take that kind of last two week break before the new year, and the state put out its plan for the vaccines. And because of our experience running these bills and just how tall that mountain is to climb every time, even though you've climbed it before, and you think the next time I work on this issue and I go talk to someone, they should sort of be maybe not here where they were last year, but like they're here. So I have to just bring them here. But every time we have to start down here. And so when the vaccine rollout was announced and I saw the definition detention center in the state's plan, and I said to a colleague, you know what? We better start asking right now before we go on break about what detention center means. Does that mean immigration detention centers, or are we just talking about prisons? And let's just start nicely to ask the question, because this is going to be like, I know it in my soul that this is going to be a mountain to climb. And they're okay, all right, let's put out the letter. Let's ask the question. So we put out the letter. Nobody answers our question. Hey, we understand the state is doing this. There's not clarity from the federal government. We're very concerned about this population. We see that you've said this. We've done a lot as a state to protect the health and safety of this population, including this year. Where are these people in our plan? Are they in our plan? What does this mean? No answer, no answer. We start to turn to our friends, other immigrant rights organizations, other, NextGen colleagues. We need to send another letter. The committee for the Community Vaccine Advisory Committee forms, and they become the target of our advocacy, a public forum focused on justice and equity. Where are immigrants in detention? So we mounted a campaign, public comments, we engaged doctors, we had doctors write in. At one point, I think we got about almost 200 public comments on the issue to the Vaccine Advisory Committee. And I'll let Adriana fill in anything she cares to share, but it was really, it was about 3 months. It took us to just sort of get an answer, and it ultimately ended up being a positive one, which is that California said, we are going to include this population. And as Adriana said, we weren't trying to bump them up in the sort of prioritization, but we needed someone to acknowledge this population. And we knew from our experience that the federal government, under Trump, they weren't great, but we knew, we didn't have any faith that the Biden administration was going to have this at the top of their priority list either, especially during a transition when they're trying to get the rollout of the vaccine to an entire nation, and we were right about that. And so for the 3 months that we did this ping pong back and forth, the federal government said, no, the states are going to handle this. The states are like, what are you talking about, the federal government? And when California finally announced that we were going to use our vaccine allocation to include this population, it was really interesting. The Washington Post actually put out an article that essentially was like, the federal government has no plan for this population. This was last month in March. And in California, I would say we don't have a very comprehensive plan, but at least we're at the step of saying, okay, we need to provide vaccine access to this population, and we're gonna, do it proactively. So that it was a successful campaign in that regard. I think that we're ahead of most states in terms of acknowledging that we cannot just leave this population aside in this great area and spend months playing with people's lives. The day that California announced this, a man was released from a detention facility here with COVID to die. And for me, it offered such a sort of clear example of how unnecessarily long this took, right? In December, we started asking the question, we didn't get clarity until March, and this gentleman died. And now we can't say the man would have taken the vaccine, but he should have been given the choice, right? If he couldn't be released, he should have been given the choice. And I think I do want to be clear, because one of the things that came up a lot with vaccine advocacy, and it's, again, the position we're often cornered into when we do immigrant rights advocacy work. I think it's very similar in the criminal justice world. You feel like you have to ask for crumbs, right? And you are put into these sort of corners where you're stuck between two bad choices, and they're false choices. And the vaccine is an example of that, where people said, well, we're trying to get people released, and if we get them the vaccine, then ICE is going to keep people in detention. And we said, no, hold on. That, if you get like a gut reaction to that being like a messed up proposition, then like figure out how to challenge it, because people have been in these facilities. People have been like fighting to get people released. Many people have been released thanks to the incredible work of litigators, advocates, and community organizers on the ground that have been outside of these facilities shedding light on what is happening, but there are still people there. And for the people that are there, they should be given the choice to have access to a life-saving vaccine. And we need to provide that. We cannot be tamped down as advocates for fear, right? That people getting the vaccine, we need to challenge that narrative. And so that's what we did. And, we did face some backlash and some level of criticism for doing that. But I think when you do this kind of work, sometimes you have to be the person that says, no, this is what I believe in. If you disagree, give me a better option, give me a different solution, share your perspective. But in the face of no other plan, action, or perspective, like this is what we're going to do. So we did that. And now we're working with some partners who are piloting a project to provide medical consultations to folks. And there are plenty of people who are not taking the vaccine in detention. And to me, that's not a sign of sort of a failure of the campaign. I think people aren't taking the vaccine, as we see in communities that are free, because of the high levels of mistrust, right, from Black and immigrant communities and people of color, for so many reasons, on the history of vaccines. And then, of course, if you're detained in a facility where the people offering you the vaccine are a private corporation or ICE. So the next sort of chapter of that work is to really shift who is providing this vaccine to folks, a trusted provider. But yes, that's sort of what we've been up to in partnership with NextGen and so many others. Just, yeah, another small chapter of the work this year.
Jackie, I mean, we could talk about this there's so much to talk about, but I know that we have, a time frame. So we have a few minutes left. I wanted to kind of talk about the 19,000 undocumented minors that have come across and the conditions that they're being held in. I wanted to talk about how do we close detention facilities, immigrant detention facilities for good. I wanted to talk a little bit about AB 263, our HOLD Act, which is, public health in these facilities, but we would need another hour to do that. So in lieu of time, I think the most important question I would have for you is, what is next for Jackie Gonzalez? Where do you want to focus your efforts? And I know that's a loaded question in itself, right? Because I can just see that, all of these ideas and all of this work that's still, there's so much to be done. There's still so much to be done. But in the short term, I guess, I won't ask you that interview question. Where do you see yourself in 5 years? What do you see yourself doing in the next year or two with IDA and in this realm that is so important?
Yeah, I'm sorry that we didn't get to some of those questions. I'm sure it's in part based on my long answers. You can tell I'm very passionate about these issues. But I do want to say quickly on the kids, we are working on the bill, AB 1140, with Assemblymember Rivas. And just the theme on the kids is that similar to the adults, we cannot, it's a federal issue, but I think we need to, as a state, think of ways that we can engage positively and proactively to help this population as they enter our state. And so I think that bills like AB 1140, which ensures that kids that are in state licensed facilities as they are making their way to family and friends are afforded the same rights, the same resources as other children in our state is a great step in the right direction. But I'll leave that at that. That could be a whole hour, the kids and the border. In terms of where I'll be, I mean, I have to be honest with you that, I didn't know 3 months ago I would spend 75% of my time in the last 3 months working on the vaccine issue. And I think that the reason, as I said, sort of at the beginning, that I wanted to launch and create IDA was to have the flexibility to step in and do things that I thought needed to be done in a time-sensitive manner, and to have the nimbleness to do that. And I did, if I'm being totally honest, I had a lot of sort of trepidation and fear. Even when we launched IDA, it was only meant to be a year. And Adriana knows, because we said we really just want to do this to be able to focus on implementing AB 32, continuing to do that work. These contracts were just signed, and that's where we're going to focus. So we did do that, but we did a lot of other things on top of that, as you heard today, AB 3228, the vaccine advocacy most recently. So I really hate to predict or try to predict what I will be up to, but I think the most important thing for me is, my fear was that once Trump was gone, there wouldn't necessarily be a point to my project, not because the work wouldn't be there, but because it would be, challenging to get people to continue to care or focus. And now I feel really different, which is I'm not sort of scared of that prospect. I will try to do my best with this platform. I think during this time to continue to make sure that this population isn't forgotten, because I think the biggest danger of the Biden administration, while we all welcome obviously a change from Trump, is that this population gets sort of put on the back burner. And we're already seeing that. I mean, I think the vaccine is a perfect example. And I think even in California, my job, our job as advocates who care about this issue has become a lot harder without Trump. It was very sexy. It was you got a lot of political sort of, points by being oppositional to Trump. And now that he's gone, there's not sort of that will. And so we need to continue to find ways to be creative, to elevate the needs of this population when it's not as politically sexy, to be quite honest, as it was before. And the vaccine issue, I like to share this because when we were doing the advocacy, Governor Newsom was asked, what's the plan for immigrants in detention with the vaccine? And he started talking about CDCR and then, pivoted quickly and said, guys, 28 days later, because this was in January, it's incredible how different things are now in these facilities than they were under Trump. And, I have a lot of deep gratitude for Governor Newsom and the incredible legislation that he has signed into law that we have worked on. Grateful, to have him as the governor. But I have to say he was wrong. Nothing is different in these facilities, and it hasn't been under Democratic administrations and it hasn't been under Republican ones. We haven't been able to pass comprehensive immigration reform when we've had a Democratic president or when we've had a Republican president. So our job is far from done. So I don't know exactly what the path will be. I think I joke to people that my happiest day will be when I don't need to have a job doing this work anymore. And until then, I will be working with people like you, Adriana, hopefully, and others to keep pushing forward creative ideas on how we can sort of rethink, the work that lies ahead.
I'm grateful, Jackie, for all the experience that you bring to the arena. I'm grateful for your passion and for your humility. You don't toot your own horn. I really look forward to many more years of partnership with you and with Hamid and with IDA or wherever it is that you go. I hope that our paths will continue to cross, both from a professional and a personal level. But, I just want to say thank you for the work that you do, for the passion that you have. Our work is not done. And you're absolutely right. We haven't been able to fix this under Democratic leadership. We haven't been able to fix this under Republican leadership. A lot of these issues in these communities fall on deaf ears. And, we're the boots on the ground. The advocacy that organizations like IDA and other immigrant rights organizations do, we have to focus on continuing the work. We have to continue to connect that nexus on this work and what it does to families from a mental health space. So I wanted to thank you very much for your time, for joining us today. Who knows, maybe we'll do part B one day and share other great successes that we can do together. And thank you, Courtnie, for allowing us to do this and to see that intersection between, you know, the trauma, the suffering, but also the good work that we've been able to do.
I just want to say that I really appreciate the time that you both put into this. I think that it's really easy to kind of get really tunnel vision into whatever your specific policy area is. And I know that for me, when I think about mental health, it's obviously all encompassing of all the mini slices of pie that NextGen policy is involved in. But it was really interesting, and I know the work that Adriana is involved in, but it's always something that's to hear it from both her perspective as well as a trusted partner such as yourself, Jackie. So I appreciate the time and the energy and the focus and the commitment that you've provided this and that you've shared with us today. And as Adriana mentioned, I look forward to seeing what you and IDA and just you authentically as a person do moving forward. So I really appreciate this time, and I'm excited that we were able to have a NextGen talks about mental health and immigrant detention centers and how we can, you know, not just talk about doing the right thing, but actually put action into doing the right and being the right. So thank you so much.